As Carthage sought to flex its military might overseas, King Hamilcar, leader of the powerful Magnid clan, was keen to gain a foothold on the strategic island of Sicily. Thus it was that in 480 BC, he launched a grand campaign to assist local Greek allies against the reigning powers of Akragas and Syracuse. This First Punic Sicilian War would climax at the Battle of Himera, which saw a fatal series of disasters lead to the ultimate defeat of the Carthaginians. For 70 years, their armies would not set foot on the island. However, the ascension of Hannibal, grandson of the slain Hamilcar, would see decades of pent-up resentment unleashed upon the island. He would ensure that the black stain of Himera would be washed clean with waves of bloodshed. This would be his finest hour. You can learn much more about the military and cultural heritage of our ancestors through our sponsor, Magellan TV. Their series Warrior's Way, for instance, covers the history of a wide range of military units from across antiquity and the Middle Ages, including the forces of the Norse, Scots, Celts, Romans, Templars, Mongols, and more. One of my favorite episodes is Sigurd Bjornsson, Viking Exile, which reconstructs the life of a Norseman who made his way across the ancient world in search of a brighter future. It's got great historical insight with amazing visuals to back them up. Documentary videos like this are added weekly to Magellan TV, which already has a collection of over 3,000 videos to choose from among categories of history, science, nature, space, and more. You can watch Sigurd Bjornsson Viking Exile or any documentary that catches your interest by clicking the link in the description below or going to try.magellantv.com/invicta to get a 1-month free trial. Enjoy! Following the expulsion of Carthage's military invasion, the victorious tyrants Theron and Gelon were able to consolidate their power on the island and even boost their geopolitical stature across the Hellenic world. Yet, as would occur in mainland Greece, the defeat of a unifying external threat quickly resulted in a return to traditional quarrels. In the same way that Athens and Sparta would soon turn on one another, this shift was also made apparent in Sicily when the new rulers of Akragas and Syracuse came to blows. In both cases, this fracturing of Greek unity would grant reprieve to their enemies. Carthage, for instance, was able to use this interbellum period to rise to new heights. They ramped up their mercantile activities across the Mediterranean and ushered in a grand age of exploration. For instance, 2 famous Punic navigators would sail exploratory fleets beyond the Pillars of Hercules, with Hamilcar heading north along the European coast in search of the Isles of Tin, and Hanno heading south along the African coast in search of new colony sites and perhaps even a circumnavigation of the continent. Stories of their exploits would be widely circulated, and exotic trophies such as gorilla skins would reportedly be displayed in the city of Carthage itself, inspiring the next generation of ambitious children. One of these would have been Hannibal, grandson of the defeated Hamilcar, who will play a key part in our upcoming story. Around this same time, we hear of how the city further expanded across the lands of North Africa, bringing more Phoenician colonies and neighbors into the fold, while striking out with distant expeditions to establish relations with the Garamantes and the Cyrenaians across the desert. Closer to home, it seems that political changes even saw the monarchy give way to a republican form of government, with new institutions such as the Cephalature, the Popular Assembly, and the Tribunal of 104, which would be praised by philosophers such as Aristotle. Amidst this newfound stability and prosperity, the Punic leaders would not lose sight of their dreams of controlling the central Mediterranean. Thus, we see them increasingly invest in the projection of soft power through trade, treaties, and the construction of new fortifications across areas of Sardinia and western Sicily. Yet for now they would bide their time and avoid outright conflict with the Greek world. For example, when the Peloponnesian War would spill over into Sicily, they carefully avoided becoming sucked into the chaos despite reportedly being asked to intercede. Best to let the Greeks bloody themselves, while waiting patiently on the sidelines. Although Carthage would remain out of the picture for another half-decade, it will still be relevant for us to give some context for the war that was about to erupt in Sicily. This would be but one chapter in the larger narrative of the Peloponnesian War, which had seen Athens and Sparta clash with their allies for hegemony of the Greek world. Starting in 431 BC and lasting over 20 years, the two sides would bloody one another in a war of escalating bloodshed. Recently, Sparta had gained the edge over an increasingly desperate Athens that now looked to even the odds. Thus, when the opportunity arose to side with the city of Segesta in a local conflict against Selinus, the Athenians pounced at the invitation to collect the funds and manpower which had been promised them for their aid. In 415 BC, they set off with a fleet of over 100 ships for the Great Sicilian Expedition. To their dismay, it was soon discovered that Segesta was in no position to pay up for the assistance as promised. But with such a force already marshaled, the invaders were not keen to turn home empty-handed. Instead, they sought to make war upon Syracuse. Victory would serve not only to cripple a potential Spartan ally, but could also bring with it far more wealth and manpower than might ever have been offered by the minor settlements of Sicily. This campaign began with initial success. In the first year, the Athenians made headway along eastern Sicily. When Syracuse attempted to march north against them, the invaders managed to sail behind them to establish a fortified beachhead in the Great Harbor. A pitched battle then ensued, which saw the Athenian veterans prevail over the Syracusans, pushing them back behind the walls. Through the entirety of 414 BC, the Athenians engaged the Syracusans in a grinding siege that saw an impressive series of walls and counterwalls constructed across the rugged outskirts of the city. As would occur many times in this period, as soon as there was blood in the water, other sharks would come out to feed. Sensing an opportunity, Sparta and Corinth now came to the aid of Syracuse with a relief force. This, in addition to ongoing attrition and disease, did much to turn the tide against the Athenians. But just as the invaders began to consider a withdrawal, the Syracusans launched a vicious naval attack which dealt heavy casualties and crippled their fleet. Fighting continued for several days, and ultimately, the Athenian commanders sought to salvage the situation by making a land retreat. This force would be devastated in the attempt, with all survivors either being executed or worked to death in the stone quarries as retribution. For the Syracusans, it was a glorious victory. Yet, as was always the case in Sicily, there was little time to celebrate before the outbreak of the next conflict. The spark for war was lit when the feud between Segesta and Selinus once again flared up. In this contest, the leaders of Segesta turned to the Carthaginians for assistance. This was precisely the opportunity that the Punic leader Hannibal was looking for. However, he also knew that provoking Syracuse prematurely could risk the campaign. Thus, envoys were sent to the eastern Greek city to prevent escalation, and even ask for arbitration of the conflict. This appears to have worked to preserve Syracusan neutrality, likely due to the idea that they were more preoccupied with the aftermath of the Athenian expedition and all the messy geopolitics that entailed. With this green light, the Carthaginians immediately hired a small mercenary force of about 6,000 Libyan and Italian mercenaries and dispatched them to Segesta. Here the force helped rout the army of Selinus. Unsurprisingly, these Greeks were furious that their rival had unilaterally sought external help in the conflict and now sought to level the field by calling upon their own allies. Once more, the dominoes of war began to fall. But while the Syracusans debated this new predicament, Carthage brought down the hammer. In 410 BC, they launched an expeditionary force which would now end the 70 years of peace and launch the Second Punic Sicilian War. Here is how Diodorus Siculus recounts their arrival in awe. Quote, "At this time, Hannibal, the general of the Carthaginians, gathered together both the mercenaries he had collected from Iberia and the soldiers he had enrolled from Libya, manned 60 ships of war, and made ready some 1,500 transports. On these he loaded the troops, the siege engines, missiles, and all the other accessories. After crossing with the fleet the Libyan Sea, he came to land in Sicily, on the promontory which lies opposite Libya and is called Lilybaeum. And at that very time, some cavalry from Selinus were tarrying in these regions, and having seen the great size of the fleet as it came to land, they speedily informed their fellow citizens of the presence of the enemy. Hannibal had all told, as Ephorus has recorded, 200,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, but as Timaeus says, not many more than 100,000 men. His ships he hauled on land in the bay about Mottia, every one of them wishing to give the Syracusans the impression that he had not come to make war upon them or to sail along the coast with his naval force against Syracuse. While modern estimates tend to place the invading army at closer to 40,000, it was nonetheless an immense force which dwarfed the roughly 20,000 or so inhabitants of Selinus and was fully capable of significantly altering the balance of power in Sicily. As the campaign got underway, Hannibal's first move was to link up with his Segestan allies and together march upon Selinus before Syracuse could respond. Unlike his grandfather, Hannibal was fully prepared to take his first fortified objective by storm. To this end, the poor state of the Selinus walls made his shock and awe tactics all the more effective. Siege towers were brought against the walls, battering rams rolled against the gates, and great streams of projectiles rained upon the defenders. Breaches were formed, and through these poured the Carthaginians, but the Greeks mounted a desperate defense to hold them at bay. We are told that this brutal fighting lasted for 9 days as the invaders slowly cut their way through the city, while under constant attack by enemy soldiers on the ground and citizens overhead who hurled projectiles down upon their ranks. Street by street, building by building, the Carthaginians advanced through Selinus until they reached the Agora. This is where the defenders made their last stand. Hannibal showed no mercy, and they were all cut down to the last, their bodies joining the 16,000 corpses which choked the bloody streets and burnt homes of the city. Diodorus reports that the army brutally murdered or enslaved all survivors, took everything of value, and engaged in a final night of rape and bloodshed before destroying the city. But the Carthaginians did not stop there. Having reasserted their dominance, they now levied local allies to swell their numbers to over 60,000 infantry and next descended upon Himera. This was both a strategic and personal objective for Hannibal. Wasting no time, he was keen not to repeat the mistakes of his grandfather and prepared to once again take this next bastion by storm. The Himerans had heard what befell their neighbors within the walls of the city and therefore decided to sally forth from the gates. This bold attempt was summarily crushed by the overwhelming force of the Carthaginians. By now, Syracuse had managed to ship 4,000 reinforcements to the city, urging calm and resolve in the face of the attack. However, the citizens were terrified of what fate might befall them and began to evacuate. Amidst the chaos, Hannibal gave no pause and now ordered his armies and siege engines to take Himera. When rumor spread that Carthage was simultaneously preparing a secret attack on Syracuse, their own troops within the city panicked. They immediately boarded their ships for home, carrying with them as many civilians as could be spared and vowing to return shortly thereafter to save the rest. Diodorus recounts what happened next. Quote, "Those who had been left behind in Himera spent the night under arms on the walls, and when dawn arrived, the Carthaginians surrounded the city and launched repeated attacks. The remaining Himerans fought with no thought for their lives, expecting the arrival of the ships. For that day, therefore, they continued to hold out. But on the next, even when the triremes were already in sight, it so happened that the wall began to fall before the blows of the siege engines, and the Iberians to pour in a body into the city. Some of the barbarians thereupon would hold off the Himerans, who rushed up to bring aid, while others, gaining command of the walls, would help their comrades get in. Now that the city had been taken by storm, for a long time the barbarians continued, with no sign of compassion, to slaughter everyone they seized. But when Hannibal issued orders to take prisoners, although the slaughter stopped, the wealth of the dwellings now became the object of plunder. Hannibal, after sacking the temples and dragging out the suppliants who had fled for them for safety, set them afire, and the city he razed to the ground, 240 years after its founding. Of the captives, he distributed the women and children among the army and kept them under guard. But the men, whom he took captive, some 3,000, he led to the spot where once his grandfather Hamilcar had been slain by Gelon, and, after torturing them, put them all to death. A terrifying message had just been sent. The might of Carthage was not to be ignored. Hannibal had made sure of it, and buried the stain of Himera alongside the thousands of dead Greeks. This demonstration sent chills across the island. Having accomplished all he wished to do, Hannibal then departed back to Carthage, taking his army and loot with him. He left behind a Sicily ravaged by warfare in his wake. In the aftermath, only the powerful cities of Akragas and Syracuse could be said to challenge Punic supremacy on the island. However, with the Carthaginian force having withdrawn, neither proved quick to act. It was only in 407 BC that an exiled Syracusan general named Hermocrates reopened the war by invading the Phoenician cities in the west. He did so by recruiting the survivors of Himera and Selinus to form a 6,000-man strong warband. These now raided the Phoenician regions of the west, burning their crops, enslaving inhabitants, and defeating local militias in battle. To shock the civilians of Syracuse into action, Hermocrates then went to the charred ruins of Himera, collected the surviving inhabitants, and sent them on to Syracuse to show what the Carthaginians had done. It appears that this move was also meant to bring about a political revolt that would overthrow the democracy of the city and see Hermocrates named its tyrant. The plan, however, fell apart and he was killed in the attempt. In response, the Carthaginians voted to resume the war and re-elected Hannibal as their general. He promptly named his Maganid kinsman Hamilcar as his second-in-command and raised another massive force for the campaign. The Greeks of Sicily caught wind of their preparations and deployed a fleet of triremes to monitor the straits between them and North Africa. In 406 BC, Hannibal was ready. A vanguard fleet was sent forth to clear the way, clashing with the Greeks in the open seas. Roughly 80 ships partook in the battle, with both sides taking heavy damage. Carthage lost 15 ships and was driven from the field, but the Syracusans were also forced to fall back shortly thereafter. The way was now clear for Hannibal, who promptly landed his forces at Mattia. The primary objective for the campaign was the Greek city of Akragas. It rivaled Syracuse in size, population, and wealth, while commanding strategic control over central Sicily. But this was no hindrance for Hannibal and his force of 60,000 soldiers. These now quickly advanced upon the city and laid siege to it. However, Akragas had learned from the prior campaigns and was ready for this. They had culled all the crops from around the city to deprive the enemy of food, whilst building up a massive reserve of supplies within their own walls. Thus it was with confidence that they rejected Carthaginian offers for surrender. Anticipating this, Hannibal tightened his stranglehold upon the city and began to deploy his siege engines. As the weeks dragged on, however, an unforeseen enemy would strike. Plague broke out in the camp of the besiegers. It's unclear as to the cause, but Diodorus Siculus, a Greek himself, claims that the Carthaginians had drawn the ire of the gods by desecrating Greek tombs. Whatever the case, thousands of men died, including the great general Hannibal himself. But his ambitious spirit would live on in Hamilcar, who redoubled the army's commitment to the siege with the construction of additional fortifications. This proved fortuitous, as a large Syracusan relief force arrived to lift the siege. These managed to defeat the Carthaginians in open battle, but could not drive them out from their defensive positions. As a result, they set up to now build their own wall of encirclement around the Punic force. Plagued with disease, and now facing the prospect of starvation, Hamilcar's forces were in a terrible position as winter began to set in. They would need a miracle to survive. Luckily for him, that miracle appeared in the form of the Carthaginian navy. In a dramatic naval ambush outside the city, the Punic fleet surprised a Syracusan supply convoy and sank or captured the entirety of its escort force. In doing so, they seized a massive hoard of grain. Now, it was the Carthaginian army whose depots overflowed with food, while those of Akragas began to dwindle. The balance of power now shifted back in Hamilcar's favor. Diodorus Siculus claims that Hamilcar recognized the leverage he had over his foe and gave them an out. Citizens would now be given a window to leave through designated corridors. Immediately, 40,000 people fled the city. This had the desired effect of completely liquidating the defenses of Akragas, which was left a husk of its former self. The following day, under a crisp and cloudy December sky, Akragas fell to the assault of the Carthaginian army. Throughout the entire winter, the Carthaginian army camped within the city, looting everything they could get their hands on. The wealth of this great city was well renowned, and the spoils must have been unimaginable. Finally, in 405 BC, with the bones of Akragas picked clean, a fattened Carthaginian army lumbered off to rejoin their fleet. They left behind the smoldering ruins of a city once hailed as the jewel of Sicily. It would never again regain its former glory. Hamilcar now proceeded to make a victory lap around Sicily. Along the way, he took a host of Sicilian cities, tearing through the defenses of Gela when it resisted, sacking Camarina, and even defeating a Syracusan army sent against them. Only the gods seemed capable of stopping the Carthaginians with another plague. It was at this point that Hamilcar finally came to the peace table. Owing to his successes, the terms were incredibly favorable. Carthage would remain in control of its recent conquests, with Selinus, Thermi, Akragas, Gela, and Camarina all bowing down as tributary vassals. Sicily had a new master. Join us next time as we explore the next stage of the Sicilian Wars. In the meantime, you can catch script previews and download art from each episode on our Patreon. A huge thanks to our current patrons for funding the channel, and a big shout out to the researchers, writers, and artists for making this episode possible. Be sure to like and subscribe for more content, and check out these other related videos. See you in the next one.